She closed the office door in Brasilia the way judges close chapters, decisively, with the practiced finality of someone who has spent a life weighing disputes and consigning them to paper. The corridors behind her smelled of polished wood and statute volumes. The light there was clinical, the world precise. In her satchel she left the brass of a gavel's echo and the expectation that a robe carried. In front of her waited a bus with cracked upholstery, a route that moved through heat and dust, and a green dress folded small enough to fit into anonymity. Anabela Menezes had been a woman of courtrooms and quiet judgments. She had also been, for years, a daughter who learned grief as a ledger never balanced. The anonymous envelope slipped under her office door 2 weeks earlier had contained a single, typed line and a photograph. Vila da Prata, registers burned, families evicted, Deputy Siqueira. No return address, no signature. The tone was raw with desperation. The photograph was a grainy shot of a market square where a silhouette leaned like a small shadow. It was not formal complaint. It was a plea that smelled of fear. The letter named a person, Deputy Siqueira, and accused him of building an empire from forged deeds and terror. It alleged that the local registry had been emptied the night it burned, and that witnesses either left or learned to keep their mouths closed. There was a professional way to handle anonymous tips, a protocol that favored teams and warrants, subpoenas and backup. Anabela had followed it for years. But the more she read the typed lines, and the more she felt the ache behind them, something tighter than professional duty pulled at her, the handwriting of an old pain, the shape of a death that had never been properly entered into the public record. She kept that part close to her ribs. For now, she let the practicalities dictate her plan. She decoupled herself from the formal apparatus, left the official phone on a desk in the Capitol, left her badge in a drawer, substituted the green dress for a suit, folded a small camera into a pocket, and took the long road toward a place where the law, if present, was cheap ink on a page somebody else owned. The bus smelled of engine oil and stale coffee, the fabric of a million journeys. It moved through roadside eucalyptus and then into red, beaten earth. The city receded into a rectangle of glass. The map of power she knew was replaced by the map of need. She watched the passengers' faces shrink to single, sure gestures. A woman stitching a hem with fingers that knew the exact way cotton surrendered. A man with a market apron. A teenager holding a battered backpack against his chest like a secret. The green dress stayed folded like a promise. She did not want to be noticed. To be invisible in Vila da Prata was protection. To be visible was to court attention she could not afford.
Vila da Prata sat along a river that had been patient enough to outlast the bridges men built and burned. Houses leaned on one another as if they were sharing heat. The main street was a thread of cracked asphalt and commerce, vendors under tarps, children who knew the timing of trucks, and shop fronts that said, in paint flaking from sun, what mainstays still survived. The square had a statue that the municipality had never afforded to repaint. There was a peculiar hush under the midday sun. People moved with a caution that was not merely the town's temperament, but the physical expression of an old intimidation. At the market, Anabela felt the town close around her like a hand. Vendors shifted their wares away when she walked past, as if their tomatoes or bananas could be contaminated by some specter of suspicion. Eyes slid from her to an empty patch of space where a man might be expected to stand. Deputy Siqueira's influence was the geometry of avoidance. They would not meet her gaze. She had not been in Vila da Prata 30 minutes before she saw the deputy's son. Junior was the kind of man raised on a certainty that his father's shadow could fix anything. He moved like someone who believed intimidation was a right, not a tactic. He had a swagger, crooked cap, motorcycle smell, and his hands were prone to theft. He noticed a vendor with a basket of cassava and reached for it as if the basket were his by birthright. The vendor, Jose, a squat man with a voice like gravel and hands that made money into food, shifted forward to block him. "That's mine," he said. The softness in the market held a memory of louder times, and for a moment everything could have returned to bite. Junior laughed, a thin bark that masked discomfort, and lifted a root. The market breathed closer, a negative space of fear. Anabela had no intention of being heroic. She had come to gather documents, to photograph, to secure a chain of custody that could withstand lawyers and intimidation. Yet there was an arithmetic of small courage and its effect.
She stepped between Junior and the vendor with a deliberately quiet posture. Her dress was plain, faded cotton, sleeves that had seen mending, shoes that had been scuffed long enough to read like a passport of modesty. She spoke with the soft authority of someone used to being obeyed without bluster. "Put it back," she said. People looked at her as if she had used an unfamiliar currency. Junior's face tightened, the muscle around his eye like a drawn wire. "And you are?" he asked, irritation and curiosity curling together. "Just someone who doesn't like thieves," she answered, and kept her voice low so the market censors, those who watched and punished, didn't have an excuse to slaughter the moment with violence. It should have been a small act. It would have been, in a town where dignity still had air. But symbols have a way of magnifying themselves.
Junior shoved the cassava back, more in posture than in respect, and the vendor grunted a thank you that tried to hide its tremor. People exhaled around them. A silence tasted like hope. It was a small thing, but in towns where fear was habitual, small things vacuumed up into meaning. Junior did not like being undone by a stranger. He spat a remark that landed like a stone against Anabela's ankle, but did not break the skin. "You don't belong here," he said. His palms flexed as if calling more men into being. He wanted the town to remember why people looked away. Anabela looked at him and smiled. Not a warm, conciliatory smile, but the narrow, precise smile of someone who keeps accounts in her head. "Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm just passing through." His eyes flicked to the satchel at her side, the cheapness of her dress. In his assessment, she might have been an annoyance, an outsider playing at righteousness. He could not have read the things inside the satchel: a small microcamera, a recorder the size of a thumb, a pack of business cards in a pocket she had no intention of showing. He could not know the judge who had left her office, whose signature could, with a stroke, transform complaints into subpoenas, into warrants that might yet unpick a web. A boy at the corner, a child who sold matches with the attention span of someone who had learned to survive on seconds, laughed quietly at the exchange. Laughter is a rot in fear. It had a contagious quality. Someone else who had been silent muttered the price of a tomato. The market resumed its rhythms, but all of them moved a little straighter. She could have left after the small victory of a cassava returned, but the anonymous tip had pointed her towards names: Dona Elvira, a retired teacher who remembered how things used to be; the registry, abandoned and left to rot; a clerk named Afonso who had been killed and whose death had never been explained. There was a ledger of land, a history of theft in ink, and a town that had learned how to make absence permanent by simply denying records. "You shouldn't stay," Seuzé said later, lowering his voice when he offered her a thin slice of shade. He was more wary than grateful. He had the kind of humility that carries a ledger of small humiliations. Anabela let the shade be enough. She accepted his piece of shade like a shield. She spoke with the patient cadence of someone who had learned to let words wear down suspicion. "I'm looking for the registry," she said, as if she were asking where the post office might be. She left out the reasons that would make people hide as if the sun were a threat: the deeds, the forgeries, the burned books. Seuzé's hands described the town for her: the registry on the square's far side, its windows nailed shut, the old teacher who kept to her porch, the deputy's house, larger than the municipal budget, which sat on a knoll overlooking the town and the river. The tale he told, unhurried as a confession, was the architecture of fear. Land that had once been split among families was now banked under single names. Farms were fenced off with letters that pretended to be legal. Anyone who complained learned to make quiet, survivalist choices. "You ever hear a shot at night?" he asked her, in the way one asks whether rain has ever stopped a river. He was not asking for drama. He was checking whether someone else had catalogued terror like weather. Anabela did not flinch. "I've read reports," she said. "I'm a long way from where important things are decided, but the rule of law should touch here." She said the words in the tone of someone saying that small things must not be left to rot. Dona Elvira came like a careworn memory, thin, voice like chaff, eyes that had not forgotten each neighbor's name. She sat on a creaking porch that had seen the town's decades. The teacher's hands, when she took Anabela's, were a map of knitting and lists. Anabela could feel the hush that lived beneath the old woman's words. They met in the late afternoon when light thinned to a forgiving shade, and the square's gossip had already finished circling. "You're not from here," Dona Elvira observed, and it was not a question but a register of fact. She squinted at the green dress as if it were an old prop. "People who come here with nothing often stay nothing." Anabela told her as much as she needed to, keeping the rest in a place that was not for public inventory.
She mentioned the registry and the burned books. She let the old teacher tell her names and dates like strings of beads. Anabela listened. In the archive of the elderly, truths are often preserved in the gaps of memory. Dona Elvira produced, from a box under her bed, a photograph, sepia and frayed, of a man with ink under his fingernails, a small stoop to his shoulders, a scribal man, a clerk with a careful heart. His name was Afonso de Menezes. Anabela's chest tightened when she saw the photograph. She had kept Afonso in a private ledger of loss. She had not intended to reveal that to anyone. The town, in its title memory, had tucked him away as something that belonged to other people's recollections. He had been a scrivener, a man who kept paper alive. His death had been a small headline once, later swallowed by convenience, his files lost or burned. To Anabela, Afonso was the human hinge on which truth might swing. "You knew him?" Dona Elvira asked, certain of the answer that she did not need. "I knew of him." Anabela's voice was steady. She did not tell the old woman everything. Some stories, she had learned, need to be dressed in the clothes of patience before they can be properly presented. The teacher nodded toward a ruined building on the edge of the square. "That registry has secrets," she said. "They say the fire took pages, but some things were moved. There was a man who kept boxes under the floorboards."
Men who work with deeds learn where the truth hides. At night, Anabela made her plan. She walked through the town as if she were a shadow that had nowhere to land. She memorized the registry's boarded windows, the way the wind knifed through a particular broken slat. She noted the patrols, if they could be called that, of uniformed men who looked less like police and more like the deputy's personal pickets. She learned the rhythm of their watchfulness. She learned the sound of a bottle hitting wood when men were drunk on their own importance. She prepared her tools with a fastidiousness that came from years of argument and filing. The micro-camera she had smuggled in was no larger than the band of a watch. It fit into her collar seam and looked like nothing to anyone who did not know how to look for small betrayals. The voice recorder fingered its teeth at her like a tiny, patient animal. She placed an SD card into a pouch that she intended to mail to an ally in Brasilia if things went well, if she could get enough that would hold up in court. It was a crucial detail, often overlooked. Evidence is only as persuasive as its ability to survive transport and a chain of custody. She could not rely on the town's post. She planned for redundancy. Digital copies, physical photographs, someone in the capital ready to seal the files at the moment they were received. The registry building crouched on the edge of a square like an old sentinel gone to sleep. Its door hung by one hinge. The paint that once declared its civic authority peeled in long strips. Inside, dust lived in vertical curtains, and the air tasted of old smoke and paper. The sunlight came through holes in the roof, making columns of light that fell on the floor like questions. Anabela moved through those columns with a tenderness usually reserved for libraries and graves. She ran her fingers over ledgers swelled with humidity and time. She could smell the ghosts of signatures. She found in time a seam in the floor where the plank would not quite align. Maybe Afonso had known to hide things in the architecture of complacency. Maybe someone after him had continued a habit of concealment. When she pried up the board, the earth beneath smelled of old ink and wood rot. Inside the cavity were wrapped bundles, some charred at the edges, some preserved by luck. The first bundle she unrolled was a sheet of paper stamped not with a municipal seal, but with something that looked like an accountant's corrected ledger. The handwriting was dense, legal flowing into the personal. There were names, families named beside farms, acres that once had boundaries, and stamps that had been forged in the style of bureaucracy. There were deeds that had once called a plot by the name of its owner, and now called it by the name of a single family.
Adrenaline did not surge in Anabela the way it might in someone younger, but a precise, cold excitement moved along her limbs, the way a lawyer feels when she holds incontrovertible evidence for a case long suspected. She photographed each bundle with deliberate reverence, letting the microcamera capture the close-up of ink, the press of the notary's seal, the edges burned but legible. The recorder lay close to her heart and began its patient, mechanical promises. She spoke, in a low voice, the names and dates, as if dictating a ledger for posterity. All of it was method and care. Each photograph was time-stamped, each motion designed to allow someone else, somewhere with authority and teeth, to verify what she had found, without the possibility of later accusation that she had altered the evidence. It felt like holding a fistful of the town's buried life. She packed the documents back the way she had found them, only slightly rearranged to allow for retrieval. She slid the SD cards into the tiny pouch she had sewn into her dress, then into a small cavity of the sole of her shoe, an old trick that smelt faintly of leather and foresight.
The plan was not to hold the physical documents long. It was to make a secure copy and then let the originals remain where they might be less likely to be seized before the legal process could secure them. There is a sound for when the world narrows to what matters: the tapping of an insect on plaster, the soft scritch of paper being moved, the whisper of a breath. Anabela worked within that sound. And then, as if the world were a mouth closing, she heard someone clear his throat in the doorway. It was too late for denial. 2 men stood framed by the doorway, their silhouettes large against the ruined light. One had a walking stick, the other had a face that seemed to have been carved by an anxious hammer. They were not uniform. They were functionaries of a different order, local henchmen who wore the right kind of suspicion like armor. Their eyes slid across the columns, found the gap in the floor, and then landed on Anabela with an interest that could not be mistaken for curiosity. "You're not from here," one of them said. His voice had a gravely patience, the sound of someone who had learned to be polite when politeness served as prelude to trouble. Valdir, in the stories that would later be told around kitchens, had a face like a word nobody wanted to read aloud. His hands were scarred. His manner suggested the slow, efficient cruelty of a man who was paid to make people forget they had names. Anabela did not reach for anything. She had made the choice, weeks before, to be visible as a woman who carried no weapon and no sign of the state. It was a calculated cruelty. She hoped for a quicker, quieter path to evidence that would prove sufficient without blood. "You should leave," she said, immediately and without pretense. The tone was not pleading.
It was a courtroom voice in a ruin, measured, composed down to the smallest syllable. Valdir crouched and looked at the unwrapped papers like a judge inspecting an exhibit. He grunted. "You're playing with fire," he said. He had the pleasure of someone who believed the fire belonged to him. Anabela smiled, a small, careful smile. "I think the fire belongs to whoever started it." At the word fire, one of the men moved as if remembering. The second man, younger, with an eye that darted noisily, shifted his weight. He was someone who had learned to obey orders with the speed of someone who feared the consequences of slowness. Anabela noted the way his knuckles whitened on the doorframe. There was something unaccustomed in his face, like a boy who had learned to be a man, but not yet the mannerisms. That man, Tiago, had the look of someone who would later find his conscience ache over the way he had been made to stand. "You shouldn't have come here alone," Valdir said. It was a statement and a rebuke. "You shouldn't have burned other people's records," Anabela replied. Her voice was still calm. She did not offer herself as a martyr or a savior. She offered herself as a bearer of proof. Those deeds show names. They show wrongs. Valdir's smile was a crack of lightless humor. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Senora." His language had an old-world politeness that was easy to lob before violence. "I have an idea," she said. "And I have a tape recorder." She spoke the last like a clinical fact. Valdir glanced at the small bulge at her collar and smirked as if she were foolish. He did not know that in that collar was a tiny camera snapping in a slow, methodical manner. "You think cameras are proof?" he asked. "Proof is not the same as belief," she said. "But proof is what courts need." Valdir stepped into the ruins with the slow certainty of someone whose footfalls were designed to terrify. The second man, Tiago, stayed near the door like a boy on the edge of a lesson. He watched Anabela and then looked at Valdir as if waiting for instruction, like a man who did not yet fully understand what his role in fear might cost him later. Outside the registry, the day folded into the hush of coming night. Voices carried across the square like a soft tide. The presence of Valdir's men was a stone added to the town's chest. Noticeable weight. "You're not going to leave with those," Valdir said finally. "Nobody walks away with the town's papers, not here." Anabela had rehearsed answers for every suggested intimidation. She had written them in the small hospital of her mind like test answers. She was, at this stage, a diplomat with her back against a wall of cracked paint. "Then let's be clear," she said, slow and precise. "If those documents confirm that land titles were forged, you will have to answer in a courtroom. I prefer the court to the field." He laughed as if she had said something absurd.
The court answers only to those who can get there without blood in their hands. Here, we have our own justice." The younger man, Tiago, looked at the ground and then at Anabela. An internal war fought itself on his face, the desire to remain loyal to the men who had raised him, and the small, intrusive notion that what they did might be shameful. He cleared his throat. "We don't have orders on you," he muttered, as if there might be a loophole. Valdir turned a look on him that was more chastisement than command. "Orders are flexible. We do what needs doing." He did not add what needs doing might mean. Anabela used the quiet like a weapon. "There is a way to resolve this without harm," she suggested. "You bring the documents to a court. You bring the men responsible. If the claims are false, the court will absolve you. If they are true, the court will order restitution. That is the law." Valdir's laugh was humorless. "You're a stranger preaching about the law," he said. "You don't understand the town." She found that she did understand the town in one sense, how silence functions as a currency. "Then you understand why people should have their names back in ink," she said. "Why families should be allowed to farm their land without fences built on a ledger of lies." His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, personal space evaporating. "You don't make demands here, Senora. You don't tell us how to run things." Anabela remained unflappable. She did not appear to weigh the risk of reaching into her satchel. She did not reach. Men like Valdir were built on assumptions that the world could be frightened into compliance. But the assumption that fear had monopoly over reality is a dangerous hubris. A small camera in a collar, a recorder in a pocket, these are the kind of harmless talismans that can make a tyrant look naked. The conversation stalled, then shifted, as it all too often does in micro-power theaters. Valdir's hand landed on his hip, not in a threat, but in a balance of presence. He smelled of rust and something animal. Tiago's eyes met Anabela's for a second. She saw in them a flicker of doubt, like a candle bullied by draft. Valdir inclined his head, dismissing the immediate possibility of any legal interference. "We'll take you in," he said at last. "You can speak to the deputy." There was a steel in his offer. It was not an offer to negotiate. It was a transfer of custody under the town's rules. Anabela nodded as if this were a predictable step. She rose and allowed herself to be guided out of the registry. She moved with the calm of someone practicing a plan that had contingencies for each eventuality. When they pushed open the door, the town's night seemed to wait, poised, as if to see whether someone had lit a spark. The air smelled of cooking and hot iron. They took her in the unadorned vehicle they used for errands that needed a certain intimidation.
The deputy's house was all excess mounted on top of intimidation. Tall gates, idle servants, the sort of rooms where leather chairs wear the shapes of men who believe their loneliness is a kind of ownership. The estate sat above the town like a stone crown. Its lights were on as if to declare security. At the gate, before she stepped into the mansion's light, Anabela let her fingers brush the small pouch under her shoe. Each of her actions had a legal purpose. She had arranged for a friend in Brasilia to receive any digital file she could send. She had a plan for her own capture as a window of potential advantage rather than a terminal moment. Law is patient. Law is also a long game with many small pieces set like traps for truth. As the men led her through the gate, she breathed the night and listened to how the town had tilted toward silence. She felt, in a small and private place, the old ache for Afonso, the clerk whose life had somewhere been recorded and then burned. She kept that pain folded like a manuscript she would only unleash when the right moment arrived. For now, the right moment might be far off. For now, she would move through the rooms of privilege with the quiet of a woman who had come to claim what had been stolen, and she would hold to the instruments she had brought: evidence, patience, the law. If the town was a body, she thought, perhaps she would be the small incision that let the poison drain. She did not count on being the surgeon who performed the operation. She counted on making a cut precise enough for others to finish the work. Before they could reach the house's inner hall, she felt a presence at her shoulder, the younger man, Tiago, more uncertain than complicit. He had not yet hardened into certainty. He had not yet decided what he owed himself. He looked at her as if waiting for a word that would explain whether she was enemy or argument. "Senora," he said, in a voice that could almost be read as regret, "maybe it's better if we talk." Anabela met her eyes. She did not leverage his uncertainty. She did not need to yet. "We are talking," she said. only with the right witnesses. He swallowed, the motion like a brief confession. Valdir tugged at his sleeve. The gate groaned a small, vast groan as it closed behind them, sealing worlds apart. The deputy's son waited in the shadow of a statue inside the entrance hall, the way thrones sit in reminders of who rules. His posture said he owned the room because his name was on the deeds that made the room what it was. He smiled when he saw Anabela, a calculated expression that meant he had been taught to enjoy the discomfort of others. "Welcome to the heart of the problem," Junior said, as if delivering a hosted tour. Anabela kept her small satchel close, and in the motion of that intimacy the recorder breathed with her. She had minutes and patience, cunning and a quiet law. The debate had been set. Now the players arranged themselves for the first bell.
Outside the estate, the town watched with a kind of suspended breath. At the market, Jose and Dona Elvira and a handful of others clung to the ritual of every day, selling, sweeping, counting change. They did not sleep easily. They had learned that the night could be a place where men with names like Siqueira made decisions that changed land. They waited, each one with their own ledger of shame and hope, and none of them yet dared to name the thing that might save them. Anabela stepped forward into the room that smelled of aged whiskey and money. She had not yet declared herself. She had not yet told them who she was. Her discovery was in her pocket, quiet and steadfast. She would not reveal her history, not yet. Not until she had more than a photograph and a whisper. Not until the law had enough to speak with a voice the town could hear.
Junior stayed on the edge of everything, a boy playing at menace. Valdir closed the distance like a judge whose sentence was always carried out. Deputy Siqueira received them from an armchair that had the suppleness of a seat that had never taught restraint. He had the sort of face that remembered its own reflection and trusted it. His voice was the low, polished sort that had convinced courts of consensus from a distance. He rose with the ease of a ruler about to speak his people's grammar. "So the town finally sent someone interesting," he said, like an announcer revealing a novelty. "Who are you, little lady in the green dress?" Anabela let the title sit for a moment. She had rehearsed how to carry herself, humble, observant, a woman who might have come for bread and a place to rest. The trick to being unnoticed was to look like the sort of person who would never have been noticed. Yet the trick carried another advantage. Being underestimated broadened the room for revelation. "Someone who hates thieves," she repeated. She put no more iron in it than necessary. Her voice was an instrument that preferred to hide its tuning in the background. Bento's smile did not break. "And what thieves are those?" he asked, each syllable oiled so it would slide, heavy and patient. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she let her eyes travel the room. The heavy curtains, the clock with a ticking that felt pecuniary rather than temporal, the portrait of a younger Bento with a hand on a city sketch like a man who wanted ownership even of maps. She let the camera in her collar tick in the way only a secret could tick, almost inaudible, almost a kindness. She let them speak into themselves long enough to be complacent. "You own a lot of land, don't you, Deputy Siqueira?" she said at last. The title landed like an accurate small stone. Some guests shifted, others held their faces in training. Bento's eyes narrowed into the small, comfortable slits of a man who has never needed to apologize. "I own what is mine," he said. "I built what I built. People owe gratitude." "Did you build it with paper or with fire?" she asked, and allowed herself the briefest shadow of a smile. The room's temperature dropped a fraction. The servant's conversation ceased. The word fire is an elemental thing. Imagined flames are as revealing as actual flames in rooms that prefer fog. Bento's laugh was a dry walnut. "You'd like to make a story out of old accidents and old debts. People are always inventing ghosts here to explain what they do not know how to do, how to make a living, how to hold on. That's one way to look at it," she said. "Another way is to look at what the burned registry no longer says." He straightened then, the way one straightens when a name is too close to a wound. "You speak of the registry like you knew where it burns," he said, now stripped of his earlier play. "You are trouble. Take her away."
Valdir's hand closed in the polite air of a man ordering a tray. He stepped forward. The movement had all the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to sending people into places from which they did not return to ordinary meals. Anabela looked at him, and in that look catalogued the distance between a man's hands and the law. She had expected the motion. She had expected restraint and threat, and had prepared words and contingencies. She had not expected Junior's face to flutter the way a young bird's does when suddenly faced with adult decisions. Tiago's eyes in the background caught her like a small, bright admission. Before Valdir could close the circle, Anabela spoke again, this time softer, close enough so that the words would not carry to the others, but loud enough for Bento himself. "Afonso de Menezes," she said. Bento's laughter cut off as if someone had slammed a door. The name moved in the room like a bell in fog. Plates might have still carried remains of dinner. The name carried an accusation that did not need flames to make heat. A hush, honed to a knife, descended on their faces. "How do you know that name?" Bento demanded. For once his voice had the nakedness of the man behind the mask. "You killed him," Anabela said simply. "You had him taken from this town, and you burned what proved what you wanted to take. You made ownership by erasure." There was a long, slow interest in the way Bento looked at her then, an appraisal that sought an edge to cut her down to size. For a moment, men who had been comfortable found themselves measuring for gaps. "That is a monstrous claim," he said. "Who are you to accuse me of such things?" She had prepared for that question as much as for their threats. In the private ledger of her mind, she had kept Afonso as a file labeled with sorrow. He had been murdered when she was young. The case had been quietly steered into a cul-de-sac. The official files in Brasilia contained no smoking gun, only omissions meant to be permanent. But here she had paper, the sort of paper that resists being made into convenient absence.
"You can call me nothing you like," she said, "but the truth calls me Anabela Menezes." The name falling into the room was like a measured stone. Faces reacted differently. Some men's mouths left a small room of silence, others simply hardened. For a heartbeat, nothing else mattered but the sound of the name in the air. Then Bento's fury arranged itself like a plan. "You are lying," he spat. "You're a faker. You think you can come here with stories and make trouble." Anabela did not flinch. She had rehearsed the moment when she would let the personal be a lever. "He had ink under his fingernails," she said. "He knew the town, the family's names, the old boundaries. He kept records so other people would not lose what belonged to them. He is my father." The confession, part strategy, part truth, exploded the room in ways no gun could.
Bento's mouth made an animal sound between noise and denial. Junior's face lost a color, then another, like paint stripped from a wall. Valdir's jaw tightened. The motion told of a man whose loyalties were bureaucratic first, blood second. Tiago's breath came out small, like someone who had been holding a secret for so long they had nearly turned to stone. Bento crossed the room then like he had crossed many things that tried to defy him, with the certainty of a man for whom consequences get rerouted before they become inconvenient. He stepped into her space, too close, as if proximity would subtract her truth by intimidation. "Aren't you smart?" he said, amused and sharp. "You come here thinking your name will open doors. Whose daughter are you, girl? Whose idea of justice is this?" "His," she said. "Afonso's. The man they killed so the town would be easier to buy." Bento's hand found the back of a chair and gripped it until the joints protested. "Afonso was a clerk," he said, "a paper pusher. He made mistakes. Maybe he died in a fire. Who can say? You come here and make ghosts for reasons." "You burned the town's memory," she said. "You profited from it." She kept her voice low, controlled. She had rehearsed every syllable so that it could be used both as accusation and as legal testimony. The microcamera had been feeding Bento's reactions into a slow, invisible file. The recorder had been stitching human names into chronological evidence. If there was a moment to startle a man into clarity, she was choosing it carefully. Bento lost his polish then. His hands no longer moved with the practiced calm of a man used to ecosystem-level control. "You will not make accusations in my house," he said. "You will not bring my name into shame." "We have the documents," Anabela said simply. "They are in the registry's floorboards. I photographed them. I recorded their dates. You made a house out of other people's loss." His face went a shade grayer, not from age but from a sudden legal nausea. "You are not the law," he said, his phrase meant to deflate her. "You are a little stranger with big stories." "I am a federal judge," she answered. She let the words rest like a hammer on something that had been balancing. The phrase landed in the room like an assertion of fact rather than a boast. If anyone wished to dismiss her by social cues, this sentence carried official weight. Some of the soldiers of habit in the house stiffened. Others in the corridors, hearing the name in the way servants do, felt the ground move. Bento staggered under it as if a small public thing had become private, his worst fear made nominal. "You," he began, and the noise was the residue of someone who had built a life on certainty and found his tools blunt. Valdir moved like a man pledged to resuscitate calm. "We could take her to the back room," he offered. "We can discuss." Anabela put her hand, invisible to some, on the small device under her shoe.
The moment was a calculus. Reveal too early and the operation collapses. Delay too long and the townspeople might lose their chance. She needed to ensure the chain of custody for the files and to make the deputy's reaction recorded in a way that could be used. The microcamera had captured Bento's face. The recorder had caught words. What they needed now was a formal legal presence to make those things incontrovertible. But she had expected this, and so had arranged for a silent line of help. Some weeks before, when she still wore a robe and moved through bureaucratic corridors with diplomatic immunity, she had told a trusted colleague in Brasilia that she might go off-grid to investigate a tip. She had given that colleague an encrypted phrase and pre-authorized a federal intervention if the phrase was used and followed by no denials. The device under her shoe contained a transmitter tied to that protocol. The federal command, Commander Neves and his COT operatives, had been given authority to intervene on silent alert should a preservation code be sent from within the town's coordinates. It was an emergency measure, rarely used, reserved for when legal processes risked being strangled by proof being destroyed. Her thumb brushed the hidden switch and pressed the line of birdsong into motion. The tiny transmitter, innocuous as a pebble, sent a coded packet, her GPS coordinates, a low bitrate stream from the collar camera, a time-stamped message that contained the word she had given her colleague in Brasilia. The message traveled through cell towers and a protocol designed to respect chain of command to the desk of Commander Neves.
For an instant, nothing happened in the room except for the sound of human breathing and a man called Bento trying to renegotiate his authority with a stranger. Then a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere, as small and unavoidable as dawn. Tiago, near the doorway, felt his own conscience like a new weight in his chest. He had never been taught how to bear it. For a moment, he looked at Anabela not as a captive but as a person who had told truth, and in doing so given something back to him that he had thought stolen, the possibility of being human without being punished. Valdir noticed the micro-movement in the doorway and bared his teeth like a predator correcting a stray. He would not tolerate wavering. He crossed to Tiago first and gripped him hard enough that a ringing sound marked the boy's ears. "Are you listening?" he hissed. "You know what happens to those who look the other way." Tiago looked at his hand where Valdir's grip had made a white map on his skin. He had been paid in fear for so long that his life's arithmetic had little room left for other currencies. For a breath he stood silent. Then he did something he had never decided he would do. He stepped toward Anabela and whispered, "The study room, near the window. There's a drawer."
Anabela kept her face still, the way a woman in court keeps her face so that testimony can be heard without drama. Tiago's whisper was small, but to her it was a universe opening. The drawer meant access to a phone, perhaps an oil lamp of paper, perhaps a chance to reach a window. It also meant that Tiago, who had learned a loyalty made of fear, chose another form of fidelity, to the truth, to what was right. Valdir looked at the pair and saw a chink. He moved like the man who wanted to remove the flaw with a hand. "No tricks," he warned. Tiago's jaw thinned. "No tricks," he said, and then, in a voice that was as much choice as surrender, "I'll be back." He left with the haste of someone who has chosen and must now pay the price. Valdir watched him go like a man who had lent a life at interest. Anabela allowed a small interim of controlled silence. She had always understood that in these rooms intimidation is a form of choreography. She had learned to count the steps and place her weight where it would not slip. Tiago returned minutes later with a small old telephone, corded, the kind that had a satisfying weight to it. He pretended to hand it to someone else, but his eyes found Anabela's again and stayed there like an appeal. When the moment was right, cheek pressed to the draw of a conversation that acted as cover, Anabela slipped the receiver into her lap, turned its seams up so that the microphone would not pick ambient noise, and pressed the key she had memorized. The sequence she entered was not a typical hotline. It was a coded link to Commander Nevis's secure line. A series of numbers and phrases that, when transmitted, would confirm location via triangulation, and more crucially, would send the live feed made by the collar camera to the command center. She spoke the minimal phrases that a woman with a plan says into a bulkhead. Names, dates, location. The transfer began. At the command post in Brasilia, a man who had garnered the respect of his board for his steady hands watched the feed in a motion that was almost ritual. Commander Nevis had been given the authority to act in such circumstances, when evidence was at immediate risk and a federal official signaled distress within coordinates under the deputy's control. He read the packet, saw the grainy, close-edge image of Bento's face, the timestamp, the recorded voice that named Afonso. He had a list of legal measures in a folder no man wanted to open. Emergency warrant for seizure of the estate, federal transport requisition, quota insertion plan. He took a breath and gave the order the law had given him the power to make. Within a quarter of an hour, the town sky would host the slow, sure outline of machines that meant law was coming with its teeth sharpened for arrest rather than fury. The timeline was plausible. In a country used to bureaucratic slow motion, there are moments when the law is fast because it must be.
Neves mobilized a small, elite team accustomed to operating in the precise seam where reason intersects violence, the Centro de Operaciones Tácticas, COT. They moved with the urgency of men who have trained for the exact circumstance in which a civic ledger is at stake. They prepared to descend not to slaughter, but to secure. Back in the living room, Bento paced like a man who watched his empire map crumble in a child's chalk. He did not yet have the knowledge that the law would be in the sky within the hour. He only felt the small collapse of explanation. "You are out of your depth," he said. "We can make this end quietly." Anabela smiled in the particular way of someone who had found the precise word that seconds a courtroom. "I have no desire to make it theatrical," she said. "I want it legal." "You will not go out of my house," he said. The sentence meant as both order and threat. He placed himself between her and the door like an orb of self-importance. "You will stay here and be made to understand what happens to those who threaten the town's order." "You mean what happens to those who threaten your order," Anabela corrected. Her voice was steady. The microcamera kept turning its slow eye. Junior, who had been a smear of arrogance for most of the evening, suddenly found his role reversed by simple proximity to the crime. He was moving between cruel theater and genuine fear. "You're playing at being important," he muttered to Anabela. "You don't know who you mess with." She looked at him with an almost gentle curiosity.
"I know a man who had ink on his fingers," she said. "I know the names of fields that belonged to families. I know what the registry still remembers. That knowledge does not belong to you." Valdir's patience snapped then, because patience is unfamiliar to those who expect their commands to be obeyed. "Enough," he said. "Take her to the back." It was a phrase intended to hide a plan, but law has a way of arriving while men arrange threats. Half a mile above the town, the first caught helicopter spiraled into position. A second arced behind. Men in dark gear readied themselves like surgeons preparing an incision, precise, practiced, not hysterical. Their mission, secure the property, detain those listed in the packet, protect evidence. Their orders were to avoid lethality unless lives were at stake. The law wants arrest, not execution. Downstairs, Tiago, who had been given a wound of conscience, now had to decide what to do with it. He had helped Anabela with the phone. Guilt often comes with a price. He could not bear men like Bento deciding fates in rooms full of leather and cigarettes. When Valdir's men came to lead Anabela away, Tiago let his eyes find her, and in that look a silent plea passed from one person to another. "Hold steady, I will do what I can." They led her through a corridor that smelled of leather and old whiskey.
It was a route planned to emphasize subjugation. The architecture had been designed to flatten ordinary resistance. They pushed open a door to a study, its window heavy with curtains. The phone they had given her, a clumsy relic, was still in her hand. She had laid a single contingency into the universe, a digital breadcrumb sent, as the recorder had been recording, to a secure server and flagged for immediate forensic pickup by the federal team. Inside the study, Bento kept up a running show of authority, speaking of property and chaos, making old men's arguments about order and true ownership. He was a man who believed the public's belief in him should be a substitute for proof. "You think your father's memory will move courts," he mocked. "Courts are moved by proof," Anabela said, "and by witnesses. I have both." "You have a story." He leaned close, inches from her face. "But stories don't change the world." She said the next thing because it mattered then and it matters later. They do when they become documents. Bento reached for her with the ease of one who never expects an equal. His hand closed on her wrist with a practiced strength meant to intimidate. It was a small, legal violence. Anabela felt the pinch and tightened her jaw to breathe through the doorknob of the moment. She let the camera keep working. She let the recorder keep its soft hum. In the study's lamplight, a small mechanical truth was being carved. They could hold her. They could not unmake the record already sent. "Let her go," Valdir said suddenly, in the voice of a man who had been told something he could not contradict. He had been listening to the doorway, and somewhere in the house the first distant sound of blades of rotors reached them like a far-off tide. The sounds were subtle at first, like the hum of an approaching storm. Bento did not yet register them. He was too wrapped in a personal fury. "We will make this private. We don't need the whole world watching." "And what if the whole world likes to watch?" Anabela asked. The recorder in her pocket caught a small, incredulous chuckle from Bento. "You have men who will answer for these things." That was the start of the unraveling. Men like Bento are hardened to rumor and softened by specifics. A recorded phrase, a date, a signature, can all operate like small, precisely placed chisels. The microcamera had filmed Bento's face as he mused and raged and kept the small theater of denial. It had recorded him moving towards the registry, a voice that might later be transcribed as conspiracy. The live feed in Brasilia had date-stamped his agitation, and Commander Neves had been finalizing the entry plan. Outside, the helicopters took up positions with the calm dignity of machines that exist to enforce law. They drifted into the town's grief like caretakers arriving to do hard, necessary work. The first strobes pierced the night, then withdrew, scouts testing approaches, ensuring minimal collateral.
They dropped lines now only as demonstration. The town's sky lighting in motions that told even the smallest children that some authority larger than a deputy's house had arrived. People stepped into doorways and pointed at the sky like viewers at a sudden show. The noise was not meant to terrify the law-abiding. It was meant to break the ritual certainty of the violent. Inside the estate, Junior scrambled at a window and peered into the dark to see machine ropes descending like silent oranges against the night. He had not counted on the law being punctual. His face, which had long been used to scaring vendors into submission, had never practiced dealing with men who moved as teams rather than bullying mobs. Valdir's composure cracked a hair. "We can't let them," he began, and then a new voice cut in from below, the loudspeaker of the lead helicopter. It boomed into the night with the authority of an official demand. "Federal operation. Cease movement. Keep your hands where we can see them. If you resist, you will be detained." The house exhaled with a new tension. Bento looked from the window to the ceiling and then at the men around him. He saw a world that no longer moved only by his intention. He bared his teeth for a fight and found instead an empty room for the moment before officialdom arrived to do the work for him. The team moved with clinical speed. They did not barrel into rooms, they secured them. They separated the house's operators from its residents with a minimum of violence. Flashbangs hissed at thresholds to disorient rather than maim. Doors were breached only when they could not be opened. COT operatives worked in choreographies they had practiced under rain and in training fields. They did not laugh, they did not gloat. They executed an order of the law to preserve documents, property, and life. One operative, close enough to be decisive, saw Bento step with emotion toward a drawer that might contain a weapon. The operative fired a specialized round designed to incapacitate, a high-impact, low-penetration shot that would not be lethal, but would immediately take away the ability to continue aggression. Bento crumbled with a surprised look to his face rather than a death. Medical personnel, part of the team, were at his side within moments. The point was not to add cruelty, but to prevent it. Men who committed acts under the illusion of unpunished power were to be arrested, not killed. The law wanted names in a docket, not bodies in the long grass. Valdir, seeing his leader downed but alive, dropped to the floor and placed his hands behind his head in the old ritual of submission. Junior scuffed, rooted to the floor, snarling like an animal finally told a command. Tiago sat down on a chair and pressed his head to his hand, as if relieving it of a heavy thing. For some this was a moment of shame, for others a moment of release. Within minutes the house was secured.
Men in dark slipped quietly through rooms, hands on the shoulders of those who had been used to ordering others. Evidence teams moved like librarians through chaos, photographing in place, wrapping in tamper-evident film, logging each item into official chain of custody forms. The microcamera stream stopped, replaced by a recorded file exported in encrypted form to the federal record system. SD cards were taken, tagged, and placed into evidence bags. The physical bundles under the registry floor would be sealed and removed in the light of morning by trained archivists and notaries who would certify authenticity. The arrest was not a spectacle of revenge so much as a demonstration that the law could be real in the town's opaque life. Men who had once thought themselves kings were taken, cuffed, read their rights. Bento's world contracted to the size of a van and a pair of handcuffs. He was transported to the custody of federal agents with a mouth still trying to make speeches that no longer found an audience. At dawn, when the town smelled of hope as much as roasted coffee, a convoy arrived, not to parade, but to secure and to set in motion the legal work that would, piece by patient piece, restore what had been taken. For days that followed, forensic teams with gloves and masks cataloged registers, compared ink and paper fibers, and unrolled the bundles that had been hidden under floorboards. The original documents, many charred, many intact, were carried into the custody of federal archivists, who sealed each in climate-controlled evidence lockers. Copies were made, digital images were authenticated, signatures were compared with samples known from previous official records. Anabela did not spend the rescue in a chest-thumping moment of triumph. She sat in the municipal square with Dona Elvira and Cesar and observed the slow logic of the law doing what the law does best. It speaks in lists and stamps, in the addition and subtraction of records. Junior and Valdir were processed. Tiago was given the option to testify about who had signed what, where, and when. For many in the town, seeing the men in uniforms who had once frightened them now working to restore property and rights was nearly miraculous because it was administratively mundane. Official letters, property titles reissued, a chain of custody created so that the courts could follow a documented path back to the loss. The federal task force had been set up to do more than arrest. It would sit for months with lawyers, surveyors, and a public notary to begin the hard, tedious work of restitution. Maps were redrawn. Boundaries were restored to the way they had been recorded in original deeds, carefully authenticated by a panel of neutral examiners. Where families had been dispossessed by fraudulent transfers, mechanisms were activated to recover land. Special legal provisions allowed for provisional use while the courts examined claims. The hearings that followed were not theatrical.
They were technical and slow and perfect in their patience, because that is how justice withstands cunning. Bento and his circle were charged with multiple counts: fraud, coercion, falsification of documents, and conspiracy. Evidence was presented not as drama, but as an accumulation. Dates, stamps, signatures, matched to handwriting samples produced from Afonso's preserved papers. Testimony from witnesses, like Dona Elvira, who had seen the man's work. and video and audio recorded covertly that had been authenticated by forensic technicians. The judge, a different justice from the one Anabela wore in Brasilia, oversaw the early stages, and the town watched censuses of proof replace nightmares. In the months that followed, the restitution began to reshape ordinary life. Dona Elvira's small plot, which had been fenced off under a forged deed, was returned to her. She walked back to the soil with a stick that her hands had once used to write chalk letters, and then, with a laugh that had the brittle joy of someone who had had too many reasons to be careful, planted seedlings. The local school, which had been a half-broken place where children did homework under a leaking roof, was chosen as a site for a modest reconstruction. There, in a ceremony that made a town cry and clap in the same motion, a small sign bearing the name Afonso de Menezes was raised, a tribute not to vengeance, but to the man who had kept the town's names, and who, through his daughter's relentless patience, lent his name to the place that would teach future generations to read their rights. Seozé reopened his little stall in the market with a different posture. He stacked tomatoes out like small flags of ordinary courage. People came to buy, and each purchase had the ceremonious air of someone practicing freedom. The first day he sold out, he sent a boy, still round from the market's rhythms, to the square to announce the sale. It was a modest victory, and the kind of small public ritual that a town stores when larger triumphs are slow. Tiago's case was more complicated. The law had to account for the man he had been and the man he chose to become. His testimony was given in a formal courtroom under oath. He spoke of meetings, of papers that he had been told to move, of fingers that had signed forms in an office that smelled of cheap ink. He admitted to participating in intimidation and to being present at the registry on the night things were moved. The judge listened, and weighing the complexity, offered him a program that included community service, mandated counseling, and the possibility of leniency for full cooperation. The town watched a boy they had once feared become a man who helped restore balance. Some forgave him quickly, others kept time on their own watches. Anabela watched him from the back of the courtroom with no triumph in her gaze, only the soft, careful weight of acknowledgement. Legal restitution took time.
Titles had to be checked against photographic and physical evidence. For many families, the documents that had been returned were proofs that the world had been theirs all along. For others, there would be appeals and protracted litigation. But the federal presence ensured that the process would not be easily subverted again. Records were digitized and stored in multiple secure sites. The registry building was repaired, its floorboards replaced, but its hidden cavity preserved and documented as a cautionary archive. A new registrar was appointed, someone with the character of a careful clerk, who would answer to both the town and federal oversight. The idea was simple. Systems that fail need architecture that is transparent and accountable. Public reaction was not all jubilation. There were still those who had been hurt in the small and quiet ways of oppression. Business relationships that once depended on the shadow of the deputy's power would take time to rebuild. Old grudges had to be untangled from debts real and imagined. But the town began to breathe with a rhythm it had not felt in generations. The rhythm of being able to complain without fear of being abducted. The rhythm of fields being worked because a family could now point to a paper that said the land was theirs. Anabela did not remain long in Vila da Prata. Her role in the operation had been decisive, but she was an instrument of law, not a celebrity of conquest. Before she left, however, there was one small ritual that mattered more than press releases or medals. In the town square, where people had once avoided eye contact for fear it might be a mark, Anabela stood to speak. She had long thought about what she would say. She did not want words that would be slogans. She wanted words that would be practical, those that could be carried like tools home. She began without ceremony, voice steady and honest. "I did not come here to be a savior," she said. "I came because someone told me there was a ledger of wrongdoing, and because the law expects its workers to keep attention on what is wrong. We brought evidence. You brought courage by remembering and by coming forward. Justice is not quick. It works slowly because it must be convincing. It works by lining up proofs, witnesses, and patience, but it is not impotent." People listened. Doña Uira, who had been small and watchful, nodded like a woman who had kept many small histories in her apron. Seozé clutched a packet of bills like someone who had not yet decided whether to taste freedom. Tiago stood a little apart, carrying both the relief of cooperation and the shame of what he had been. Anabela continued, "We will need to keep being watchful. The law is a guardrail, not a quick fix. It requires participation, attestations, signatures, willingness to testify. If the town wants its memory back, it will have to help the law hold it.
She looked out at them as if cataloging the courage in their faces.
You don't have to like the process. You only have to be part of it. She told them something that mattered to her, that the law had been her language since she was young. We could find them again. At the end of her small speech, someone suggested naming the refurbished school after Afonso. It was the kind of symbolic act that towns need to anchor memory. The suggestion rose like shared breath, and the idea stuck, a place of learning bearing the name of the man who had kept the town's ledger of names. The mayor, temporary and under federal supervision, arranged it, and the plaque was unveiled on a bright, wind-soft day. Donna Elvira cut the ribbon. Children ran their fingers over the letters, as if tracing the shape of promise. In private, Anabela walked with Donna Elvira through the market. They moved slowly, smelling the roast of coffee, the dampness of spices, the familiarity of hands that had worked too long. "You brought him back," Donna Elvira said, voice thin and strong. "Not by killing, not by angry songs. You did it by handwriting." Anabela felt the old ache for Afonso shift into something more durable, a ledger balanced in the mind's account. "Not just me," she answered. "Everyone who remembered, who helped, who signed a paper. It is a lot of small things." By the time she returned to Brasilia, the town's case was a long file in the federal system, stamped, categorized, ready for the slow work of justice. Bento Siqueira faced the weight of a court that would examine signatures and the implausibility of ownership assembled by fire and forged paper. The legal work that followed involved hearings, expert testimony about ink and fiber, and the personal pleadings of those dispossessed. It was noisy in courtrooms, and quiet in offices where lawyers argued over adjectives and counts. The law marched in lists and motions. It did not indulge in theatricality. Months later, sitting at her polished desk, Anabela received letters of thanks and small gifts, an old jar of jam from Donna Elvira, a message from Cézé about a harvest. She kept them in a drawer like a small archive of normalcy. She had not come to be thanked. She had come because evidence is a stubborn thing. It resists being lost when people are willing to look for it. She also received a note from Tiago. He wrote in a shaky hand. He was taking classes, he had spoken in court, he would try to be better. He asked for nothing except acknowledgement that he had been more than his worst moment. She wrote back a short sentence, that the law could make room for those who chose differently.
The exchange was not a redemption arc written on a stage. It was a human negotiation that the legal system could hold and that the town could witness. Legal scholars later used the case as an example of how a small, well-orchestrated federal intervention, backed by meticulous evidence, can restore civic confidence in places where tyranny became habit. Students came to Vila da Prata to learn how to handle tampered registries, how to preserve charred paper, how to build redundancies in evidence chains so no one could again burn a community out of existence. The practical work of training new registrars and auditors gave the town a permanent shield, increased transparency, and multiple copies of records stored in distant, secure locations. Anabela's role in that technical parade diminished with time. She returned to the bench in Brasilia, where paper and patience remained her vocation. Yet whenever she passed the registry's files or read an affidavit from a rural claimant restored to their land, she felt privately like a guardian who had helped the town reclaim its name. The story of the judge in the green dress did not become a legend of vengeance. It became a lesson in method, how patience, evidence, and the steady procedures of a state can be used to rescue the small lives terror had tried to erase. The town square held a new rhythm, no longer a cadence of avoidance, but the measured pace of market days and school bells. The tomatoes on Cézé's stall grew glossy and bright under the sun that now shone on restored plots. At the ceremony for the school, Anabela spoke briefly. "Justice is not a single day," she said. "It's the slow, persistent reweaving of what was cut. It requires those who remember to speak up, and those who have power to use it gently, with evidence and restraint. To revenge is easy. To restore is difficult. We came here to restore." People applauded. There were tears and many small smiles. The plaque with Afonso's name shone in the sun as if it had always been there. In the end, the empire of terror that had been built on forged deeds and fear was diminished not by dramatic bloodshed, but by bureaucratic correctness. Evidence catalogued, chains of custody honored, hearings held,
titles returned. The men who had enforced Bento's will learned the law's patience. Some would be punished in court, others would disappear into the anonymity of quiet prisons or rehabilitation programs. The town moved forward, imperfectly, but with its names beginning to line up again in ink. Anabela, on the day she left for Brasilia, stood by the bus with a small satchel and a green dress folded like a memory. Dona Elvira kissed her cheek and handed her a little packet of seeds. "Plant them somewhere," the old woman said, half laughing, half sincere. "Let them remind you what small things can do." She placed the seeds in her satchel and kept them there like a private registry of hope.
As the bus pulled away from the river and the bridge that had known the town's traffic for generations, she looked back at a place that had taught her as much as she had taught it. Vila da Prata would not be the same. It would be in many ways better for having its history made visible again. Justice, she thought, is an old machine, noisy and bureaucratic and stubbornly polite. It takes time and evidence and the unwillingness to be intimidated. Sometimes it requires a person willing to become invisible for a while so it can be seen. That was why she had boarded the bus with a green dress folded small in her back. Not for theatrics, but because history sometimes asks for small, practical disguises to make sure truth can move. If this story stayed with you, tell someone who believes in the slow work of justice. Share where you've seen small tyrannies undone by evidence and patience. Your comment might be the first thread that helps someone else find their voice.